Good day everyone, so this is a bit of an interesting topic. Can we trust theorycrafters in Genshin Impact? And I think this is one of those extremely loaded questions that we have to sort of break down very systematically. So in my personal opinion, can I trust the theory, the findings from theorycrafters? Pretty much yes. So for instance, if someone goes into Genshin Impact and they do a frame by frame count of a character's abilities, or how to do certain animation cancels, or how the interaction between, let's say, Dendro and Dendro cores interact with, let's say, a cryo aura on the enemy. These sorts of things I can trust because they are things that are replicable. They are things that I, as a person or as a player, can actually also come to the conclusion myself. And very often, when I look at the theory crafting material, there's enough like resources or evidence or whatever for me to go and try out a lot of these things. So in that sense, a lot of the main results in theory crafting, I think we can trust. A lot of the softer things, for instance, what characters should you be pulling for? What are the character recommendations? What are the top tier meta teams in the Abyss? These things are actually like a lot. They actually lead to a lot of contention, and a lot of the reasons why people find these things contentious is because they don't understand what the underlying question was that sort of led to that result. So in other words, if I had to ask you the question, what is the best team in the game, assuming only like C0 5 stars and C6 4 stars, then obviously that answer is going to be very different from asking you what is the best and fastest team to clear the Spiral Abyss, and that answer is also is going to be very different from asking you what is the best team assuming all characters are at max potential, max gear and everything. And not only that, but even something as simple as assuming you can answer the question, how does this then sort of practically play out? Because one thing we know in Genshin Impact is, well, especially in the Spiral Abyss, is that your positioning matters. The order in which you use your abilities greatly matters. How you manipulate the enemy AI, how you understand the cooldowns and how the enemy AI will respond as a result to your cooldowns and so on is so important. So basically, when someone comes up and says, well, I don't recommend Nilo, it's like, okay, I perfectly understand you don't recommend Nilo, just explain why. And once you've explained why, I might be able to accept your conclusion from your perspective. So for instance, the question that you might answer might be a valid question, and the valid answer to that question might be, yeah, don't pull for Nilo. For instance, on my account, the question is, does a character synergize really well with Kokomi? And is there a new team that it unlocks for Kokomi? And in Nilo's case, the answer is yes. So yeah, I'm very happy to pull for Nilo. In the case of someone like Sinnoh, the answer is no. So that's why I'm not really going to pull for him. That is my question. That is the one that I'm sort of using when I make my recommendations and towards when it comes to pulling and so on. But I mean, this is definitely very different. So someone from the from the speedrunning community might be saying, well, can I do a bunch of damage with a C6 R5 Nilo? And if the answer is no, then I'm going to skip her. And yeah, that is a legitimate answer to that question. And I think that is like really cool. But there is something else we also need to consider. How did people get to their conclusion? So for instance, if someone says this is the top meta team and we all have bought into the question, we all agree on the constraints and the parameters and so on, the very big question now is, how did we actually go about answering that question? Did we use a spreadsheet? Did we use some sort of calculator to run a simulation that gave us some damage numbers? And I think these things are also very important to contextualize and understand, because a lot of the time we can get contentious results. So let's say I'm running a simulation software, and as an output from a simulation software, I've got about, let's say, 100 teams that are ranked by average DPS per second. The question now becomes, well, can I really trust the results? So a lot of people might say, well, if we look at the simulation software, it assumes, you know, there's a static enemy, it's got an infinite health pool, and we're just trying to get more or less the damage over time. And in a certain sense, some people might find that cool and interesting to sort of see, well, what the computer can come up with. But a lot of people might have more practical concerns and say, well, look, I need to dodge this enemy. I only have like 170 milliseconds of reaction time. I can't, do perfect headshots with a bow character on like a single frame basis, as the computer assumes. And very often you'll find that then this sort of starts leading into a lot of questions as regards the actual like use of a ranking system like that from the simulation software. And this is quite rightly where people can then have certain debates. So very, very skilled players that can mimic what the computer can do might be like, well, yeah, I trust the recommendation and I find it fun to play with. But other players might just be like, yeah, you know what, this is just way too far. It's just too different from my practical experience, and hence I'm not going to trust it. And very often this difference between, let's say, player skill gap and the theoretical and practical computations is often sort of jokingly attributed to like just a skill issue, but I don't think that's like a healthy way of looking at the problem. We must recognize that different people have different skills, and hence the sort of meta recommendation should almost be like saying, well, look, listen, these top 10 DPS teams all have different ways of dealing that damage, and hence, if you want to give people buy-in into some sort of list that you've created, assuming we've all agreed on the prior parameters to generate the list, what you then would have to do is explain why there are differences on that list. So just to make this more practical, as you can see in the background, I've got a team of Yamiko Official and obviously Colin Sucrose, and this team very consistently over time deal damage to the Magukinki. You can see there's no real big spikes in damage, but if I had to run let's say another meta team, and let's assume that meta team involved Raiden and Eula, just for example's sake, what you'd find is that that team would have very big spikes, so from Raiden's slash and from Eula's like big burst, but they would otherwise then have lots of like periods of downtime. And even though you could then theoretically get that the two teams have, let's say, more or less the same average, the way in which they deal damage is like so different. So even if you do have a ranking system with lots of teams that are sitting like very, very close together, considering how they deal that damage, how that damage evolves over time, is also something that is so important. And this is what I often say, this is one of my big criticisms against the Genshin Sim software, is that the guys they've done everything in terms of building the setup and so on, but when it comes to the interpretation of the results and using the correct statistical methods to understand why certain teams perform in a certain way versus others, so in other words, we compare distributions using like stochastic methodologies and so on, that is when the interesting conversations can really start happening. And that's where we can also then draw in more casual players and tell them, look, it is okay if you use these and these teams instead as an alternative to some of the meta teams, because they might not be that far off. And I think that is sort of a much healthier way the theory crafting community can get more buy-in from the practical players. The casual players. But knowing casual players, they very often, I think it'll be a miracle to get someone to that point of having that conversation. But certainly it is an interesting topic, like how far do you need to trust all of these things, and hopefully with everything that I've said today, you guys can sort of now understand that there's much more than just use unit X or unit Y, or just a couple of one-liners as to why one character is good and another is bad. The situation is far more complicated, and once you start probing assumptions, methodologies and these things, the discussion is not a one of like yes or no, but it can actually be a very rich discussion as to why.